Hello, I am Peter Vermeulen from Autism in Context in Belgium. In this presentation, I will introduce you to a rather new concept for describing and explaining autism spectrum disorders, namely context blindness.
I think many of you have heard about autism, all of you probably, and most of you also know the characteristics of autism. They have been defined and published in big manuals like the DSM, a manual for psychiatric conditions. And I think all of you know that when we speak about autism, we speak about people who have persistent deficits in social interaction, social communication, and who also show in their behaviors a form of lack of flexibility through, for instance, resistance against changes and repetitive patterns of behaviors and interests. But to me, these are not actually describing autism because many of the behaviors that are mentioned in these descriptions of autism are to me human behaviors, and they are actually more the consequence of autism than they are autism itself. And many of them are linked to stress and anxiety. I think most of us are not very flexible when we are very stressed. When I started my career in autism some 30 years ago, I was trained by the people from Teach North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and they introduced me to the metaphor of the iceberg and saying that the behaviors that we see in people on the autism spectrum and actually the behaviors that we see in all people are always the consequence of how we understand the world, because our behaviors are reactions to the world, the way we understand it. So if you really want to understand autism, you need to see why these behaviors that are mentioned in the diagnostic criteria are there. We need, in other words, to dive into something that's invisible underneath the top of the iceberg is the biggest part, and that's the autistic psychology. Underneath there is the autistic biology. I won't cover that one in this presentation. But what I'm actually saying here is if you want to become autism friendly, and probably you want to because otherwise you would not be watching this presentation, then you need to understand and see the world through autistic eyes. We have a word for that. We say this is empathy. So knowledge of autistic thinking is the key to success in education and treatment. And recently there have been several, well, rather amazing discoveries about the human brain in general and the autistic brain in particular, and they are connected to what we can call contextual sensitivity. But let me just start with a few questions. Okay, what do you see here? Well, most people, when I ask them, say, either it's a stamp that they see, or it's a cushion or a pillow, or it's a frame, or it's a piece of ravioli. I don't know what you saw, but probably it's one of these or maybe something else. If I would ask you how this woman feels, well, I think many of you will answer with things like, well, probably she feels sad, or she's maybe anxious, or she's maybe worried, or she might be disappointed. Okay, and here's my last one. What do you see here? Well, again, most people say either it's a letter B or a number 13. Okay, remember what you've seen and what your answer was. Basic problem in autism is uncertainty. Thanks to Albert Einstein, we know that everything is relative, and that's actually the difficulty for autistic brains, that nothing has an absolute meaning. Let's take the example of a red traffic light. What does it mean? When you see this, what should you do? Well, you will say, that's logical, that's very simple, I need to stop. Well, does a red traffic light always mean you have to stop? No, not always. A red traffic light tells you to stop when you haven't started to cross the street. But imagine you're already halfway the crossing and the light changes from green to red. Well, then it means hurry up. Actually, it means the opposite of stop. Don't stop if you want to survive. And imagine you find yourself during rush hour in a very big city like Paris and you want to cross the Champs-Élysées, which is a broad avenue with 6 lanes, and you just put one foot, then a red traffic light probably means, well, it's safer to go back and take your foot back. So a red traffic light does not always mean the same. How does your brain know how to react when you see a red light if it can mean so many different things? Does your brain use some logical reasoning? When you're finding yourself halfway to crossing the line changes from green to red, do you start to use some logic to find out what you should do? Do you use some formulas that help you to calculate, the risk of surviving if you stop or hurry up or return back? Probably not. No, most certainly not. Does your brain put all the elements together in a very fast way, like, oh, this is Paris, it's rush hour, it's 6 lanes, and I know the French are lousy drivers, hopefully none of you has French origins when I say this, and then quickly decide, well, it's safer to go back? Yes. Well, that's what most people think our brain does, but this is not true. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings in psychology, that we think that perception and sense making is a kind of the brain puzzling together all the details to reach meaning and to know how we should react to the world. And that's a huge misconception. As if we only recognize a car when we put together all the different pieces of the car. Hey, I see 4 wheels, I see a bumper, I see a rear window, a front window. This must be a car. Now, Daniel Kahneman wrote a wonderful book about that, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And he said most of the time, our brain does not do all this puzzling because there isn't enough time to calculate and put all the pieces together. If you would only recognize a car by putting together all the different pieces of the car and then kind of deciding based on reasoning, oh, this is a car approaching me, you would never survive. So it's a huge misunderstanding that the brain is a kind of a very fast computer. The brain is actually not computing, and the standard idea about the brain compares the brain to a traditional computer with its input coming from the senses and then the processing and then the output. But the brain is not computing, it makes guesses. And now, this is not academic language. When I say it means guesses, I'm talking about what is now known as the predictive mind. The brain does not wait until it gets information about the world to react. It predicts the world. And most of the time, our brain is pretty good at making guesses. And why is that so? Because the brain uses context. So we live in a kind of a relative world where nothing has an absolute meaning. A red traffic light could mean go back, stop, or don't stop. And since nothing has an absolute meaning, our brain became an expert in using context for making these quick and smart guesses about what to do. So remember this one, that could be either the letter B or the number 13. But if I would have shown you this and asked you, could you please read what's here? I think few people would say A13C, just as few as people would say here 12B14. In the context of numbers, you would see this as 12, 13, 14, while it's exactly the same stimulus as the B that you saw in ABC. Now, this is a capacity called contextual sensitivity. What if your brain would miss that? Then we're talking about autism. The theoretical definition is autism is the consequence of a reduced ability to use context spontaneously to give meaning to the world. Remember when I asked you the first drawing what it was? Well, a boy with autism was asked to describe what he saw, and he said, I see a doll, a bed, and a quilt. A bed and a quilt. And then they pointed to the pillow, and he was asked, what do you think that is? And he answered, a piece of ravioli. Now again, this could have been a piece of ravioli, because some of you probably thought of a piece of ravioli when I showed you the detail. But based in this context, you would not say this piece of ravioli. What does this say about the autistic brain? It says that the autistic brain is a kind of an absolute thinking brain and a relative world. It makes a connection between a stimulus and a meaning, but without using the context to be flexible in those meanings. In other words, if you learn that a red traffic light or a sign that says don't walk means don't walk, that's exactly what you will do if you have an autistic brain. And I advise you strongly to go and watch the movie Rain Man, 1988, already more than 30 years old, but still one of the best movies to illustrate this autistic thinking. And Raymond crosses a street, and when he's halfway, the light changes from green to red. And what does he do? Well, he does what a red traffic light means, at least what we learned that it meant when we learned it, namely stop. So this is the difference between a neurotypical brain and a relative brain. Neurotypical brains tend to play around in a very flexible way with the many different meanings of things based on context, while autistic brains tend to rely on what they have learned and have more fixed meanings. Now, how can we link that to the behaviors that we see in autism, the difficulties with social interaction, with communication, the sensory issues as well, and the flexibility? Well, let me give some short examples. And let's start with what most people connect autism to, namely difficulties in social interaction. I can assure you that in order to recognize emotions in people, to understand other people's behavior, to develop social skills, and to know what other people are thinking and feeling, something known as mind reading or theory of minds, you need to have context. Let me just start with recognizing emotions. How do you actually recognize emotions, do you think? Well, most people think that we recognize emotions by watching the face, and then we learn to attach labels to the facial expression, like, okay, he looks sad, she looks happy. This is actually not true. The reason is, and I was a little bit too fast, both. We never see facial expressions out of context, but there is no fixed connection between a facial expression and an emotion. Remember, nothing has an absolute meaning. It's a relative world. And what is true for a red traffic light is also true for facial expressions. It's not because you see an expression like this one with a tear and the mouth going down that it's necessarily sadness. Remember when I asked you, how does this woman feel? I'm pretty sure that nobody will have answered, not you either, oh, she's very happy. She's extremely positive about herself and what happened. But actually she is. If I get you the context, then you suddenly see that probably she's not sad. Well, at least most athletes are not sad when they win a medal. And this is confusing for autistic brains, because one autistic man was watching the Olympics and he saw something similar to this, and he was confused because he said to his mother, why is she sad? She's supposed to be happy. She just won a medal. And his mother said, she is happy. He said, no, I see tears. So you see, we think that there is a fixed connection between facial expression and emotion, but it's not because you see faces like these that they are necessarily connected to a negative emotion. Actually, they could also be connected to making onion soup in this case. So facial expressions are inherently ambiguous, and therefore our brain uses context to recognize emotions. Without context, this lady could be either sad or very happy, and laughing or crying. With context, it becomes a little bit easier to make sense of her facial expression. And actually, context is even more important than the face. We can test this when we put the brain into a dilemma, and we kind of make a contradiction between the facial expression and the emotional content of the situation. What would the brain pick then? For instance, in this case, you see a facial expression of disgust, but the whole situation is one connected to fear. If we would show this picture very fast, 150 milliseconds, to people and ask them how did the man feel, would they say disgusted or afraid? Well, I can tell you, they would say afraid. So when we show an angry face in the context of fear, people tend to think that they saw a fearful face. When we put a fearful face in a context connected to anger, people will say that man or that woman looked angry. So if we show a picture like the one on the right, again, very shortly, very fast, and ask children, is this girl happy or sad? They will say happy. And I'm showing this picture because it has been used in autism research. A study published by Dina Tell and Denise Davidson in 2014, and they showed that picture to children with and without autism. And as you can see, non-autistic children, the typically developing children, those are the bars on the left, 90% said that this girl was happy. While if you look at the bars on the right, almost 70% of the autistic children said that she was sad. So actually, autistic people are the only ones using faces rather than context to recognize emotions. And this is not just true for facial expressions, this is true for social cognition in general. Agustin Ibanez, together with Sandra Baz, he pulled together a whole battery of tests that measure social intelligence and social cognition and offered them to autistic and non-autistic adults. And what he discovered was that in all those tests where you can take a social decision based on rules, like a test for moral judgment, where you can use absolute rules and use logical reasoning, there was no difference in performance between the autistic and the non-autistic group. However, in all those tests where you had to make a decision, a quick guess based on implicit coding of context, he saw an impaired performance in the autistic population. And the same is true for knowing how to react to the world and for understanding the social world. What Eva Lott did was very nice. She showed children with and without autism short pictures of a social script, like going to a restaurant, and then asked them to describe how that goes. And what she discovered is that many autistic children tend to use elements of a social script as absolute and fixed rather than contextual. For instance, some children said, when you go to a restaurant, you end with having a dessert. Well, non-autistic children would say, sometimes you have dessert, based on whether there's time, whether what's on the menu, and so on. And that's why social skills training actually is not a good idea if you don't contextualize it. I taught autistic adults many years ago how to welcome people at their home. And in my scripts, to things like, okay, welcome your guest and say, for instance, good afternoon, ma'am and sir. Please do come in. Can I take your coat? And then we practiced it. But when we practiced it, it was a very warm and shiny, sunny day, and nobody was wearing a coat. But my autistic participants in my social skills training, they did say, good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome. Can I take your coat? Which was not necessary. So actually, the biggest issue in autism is not the social skills training. In other words, knowing what to do and how to do. The biggest problem is knowing where and when to do those things. So it's all about contextualizing your social skills. And the same is true for communication. Everything is depending on context. Context helps us to avoid confusion of the ever-changing meanings of what people say or show to us. Because whatever people use to communicate, whether it's spoken words like I'm doing, whether it's pictures like I'm doing right now, gestures or even objects, the meaning is not fixed. If you ever have a chance, please take a dictionary if you find one, because most people use internet now, and you will find this, that almost every word has multiple meanings. And this is confusing when you have the tendency to be absolute in your thinking. This is no problem for a contextual sensitive brain, because based on the context, it will navigate between the different meanings. So if I offer you a sentence in English like Peter approached the bank, well, based on the context, it could mean two things. When I say Peter just received an awful lot of money and he wanted it to be safe, so he get out and walks out and now he's approaching the bank, that's going to be a different bank than when I say Peter loved nature and he came out of the forest during his walk and now he approached the bank. Because in the first case, we're talking about the building. In the second context, we're talking about the bank of the river. And the same is actually true for concrete words. A woman, a mother was making pizza with her son and somebody rang at the front door, the bell, and she asked him, could you please open the door? And he opened the back door. When somebody's asking you to open the door, Well, if there are many doors in the room, you have to use context to know which door. And for this autistic boy, he took the first door he saw. So what is difficult for autistic people is to find out what something means in this particular context. And this is also true even for visuals. When you see this on your day schedule, saying you have to play, well, there's many different things to play. Okay, what about sensory issues? Well, to be short, there's recent evidence that our sensory system is also contextual sensitive. That means based on the context, you will expect certain sensory input. And when you do not expect the sensory input, it can come in as a very unpleasant surprise. So there's now a lot of scientific research that the sensory hypersensitivity that we see in autism is actually based on the fact that autistic people have difficulties using context to predict they're going to hear something or smell something. So predictability, and especially the uncertainty about the sensory environment, causes a lot of sensory issues. And then the last one, where do these restricted repetitive behaviors come from? Well, from two ways. First of all, they are a reflection of the absolute thinking of an autistic brain, but they're also kind of a coping strategy. If the world is full of flexible, ever-changing meanings and very unpredictable, then it's logical that you start to create your own little predictable world with your stereotyped interests and your stereotyped routines. The biggest thing to me, however, is the uncertainty and the confusion. When you go to a hamburger restaurant, you expect something. And that's what an autistic person that I took to a hamburger restaurant also expected, namely that he had to queue until he's at the counter in order to make his order. But it was in Brussels, it was a busy day, so there were students already taking the order while you were queuing. And to him, his whole world collapsed. He got a meltdown. He was very anxious and he said, "This is not a real hamburger restaurant." So his whole world collapsed because of the fact that he could not predict the changes in the meaning of how to order a hamburger in a restaurant based on the context. Just as it must have come to a complete surprise when Rain Man learned that even when it's red, you need to continue walking. So what we need to do if you want to help autistic people to survive in a world with ever-changing meanings, and they change according to context, but they miss the ability to use context to navigate between all those different meanings, is to push the context button. That's what we did with autistic adult, telling him, look, when there are a lot of tourists, when it's very busy, then they use a different procedure for ordering your menu at a hamburger restaurant. That's what I need to explain in my social skills training too. You only ask a person to take their coat when they are actually wearing a coat. I call that pushing the context button. You can learn more about it in my book and also on my website. Let me just end with a short video summarizing my presentation on autism as context blindness. Okay, I hope you could put all the information in context and that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much for watching.